All right, so welcome everybody to workshop session 11A, International Adoption, Trauma and Climate Change, Envisioning a Sustainable Future for All. And so today we are going to be hearing from Megan Warner. Megan is an adoptee from Nanchang, Yiangshi, I think. I apologize if I'm butchering that, who lives in Eugene, Oregon, as a hiker and climate educator for K through 12 youth. And so I'm going to quickly introduce myself. So I'm Kylie Regan, and I'm a Hudson Valley Family Support Specialist at AFFCNY, and I'm going to be your moderator. And so I just, again, want to remind, if you haven't heard this over and over again, but remind everyone that training certificates are available for the conference. So to make sure that you have your Zoom name listed exactly as you would like it to appear on your certificate, we want to make sure that we give you credit. And so I'm going to be dropping a few links in the chat box for filling out the certificate, and please do so at the end of the conference. And a bit of information about the book table fundraiser and the conference workshop evaluations. And so if you have any questions during the workshop, feel free to put them in the chat, unless Megan, you would like people to, if you invite people to unmute themselves, but we're going to keep everyone muted for the meantime so that we can hear Megan clearly. And Megan as well, I don't know if you've already put some of your, your PowerPoints or any handouts, slides, etc. But if you would like to put those in the AFFCNY network on your event so that everybody has access to that afterwards so that this conversation can continue. All right, and that's enough from me. And I'm going to pass to you, Megan.
Awesome, thank you. Here, I will share my slides. But yeah, my name is Megan, and right now I work at a nonprofit and I teach waste prevention education for K through 12. But within that, I think I've really become passionate about sort of the intersections with sustainability and mental health, and also environmental justice and equity within these contexts. And I recently, I think, as an adoptee, started getting interested in birth searching, as well as just sort of exploring how adoption has personally affected my life, and how adoptees are really, specifically international adoptees, I think this year have found kind of voices and spaces in social media throughout COVID, which has been really inspiring for me. So in that way, I've connected a lot more with adoptees from around the world, but mostly China. So I was adopted in 1997. My parents are white, and my dad came and picked me up while my mom took care of my siblings. My siblings are related by birth, so I'm the only adopted one. And then I grew up mostly in New Jersey and spent most of my 8 through 22 in Arizona. And now I find myself in Oregon. And so, yeah, I love the picture on the right, but that's me as a little baby. And I actually was given a Chinese name in the orphanage. It wasn't given to me by my parents, but the orphanages were named from the orphanage directors. So my Chinese name was Chao Chun Jing, but I don't really tell many people that, nor do I go by that. But it's interesting to think about ways in which my name has been changed. And so I like to just start with pictures of my favorite places in the world. The lower right is in Fort Hill, Pennsylvania. It is a family camp where I grew up and really developed my love for the outdoors and being in nature. And kind of, I have really found this idea of home, being an adoptee, living in many different places, as home is really wherever you go. But for me, the sense of home is greatest in nature. And so I'll give a little background about my story, but mostly I want to just talk about climate emotions because that's really what I'm passionate about. But I think it's interesting to consider like the ways in which I've learned about my past and how I connect that to my future and my present. But I think one of the top questions that international adoptees get is like, where are you from? I get this all the time. And only recently have I been like, have had to think multiple times of how I want to answer this question, because in the past I'd just be like, I'm from Arizona, and then like the conversation stops. But then I realized like, oh, I look different. Maybe people are actually asking like where I'm like where I was born. I don't know. But now I have this weird association with this identity in which I was born in China, but I was raised in the US. But both of these countries are two of the worst polluters in the world. So historically, China and the US have contributed the most to climate change. So I think this is just interesting for me to sort of explore like why two very, very different countries have emerged in this sort of like phase of development, which is actively destroying the planet and impacting the most vulnerable countries, which are typically smaller developing countries. And then I sort of think about the ways in which the climate crisis is sort of similar to the time that I was adopted. And like essentially I was adopted during a time when the government was worried about feeding their people and they were worried about overpopulation. And they made a law that was like, you can only have one child. So this really infringed upon human rights, specific, I would say like mostly women's rights, but as well as all of the families involved, because no one had a choice in this policy really. It also forced a lot of like interesting, I don't know, people that emerged in this scene of like, there were traffickers, there were people who were stealing babies to be able to sell them to American families. Like there were people who were submitted to forced abortion. So it was really, honestly, an all-around violation of human rights. And so I sort of reflect, only recently have I actually been seeing adoption as like a loss. And so for me, like it really was a loss of culture, loss of identity. And for my parents, it was their loss of my life. So recently I've been sort of thinking about this process of grieving. And like, I think for international adoptees, like we aren't always given spaces to grieve. I personally did not attend therapy when I was younger. Like I don't know, my parents never thought about it. I started attending therapy as an adult after working in wilderness therapy because I kind of needed therapy for that. And then I sort of got into this like adoption therapy. But I think it's interesting that a lot of my background and my origin was basically like, I don't know what the word is, not like erased, but there wasn't really space for me to acknowledge what had happened because it was childhood trauma. So my reaction from my birth parents was very much this attitude of like, unless Megan asks, like we're not going to really bring it up. When a lot of people ask if I was like raised with like Chinese language or culture, and like I wasn't, I don't know how I would have reacted as a child, to be honest, but my parents' perspective was very much that they didn't want to like make me further feel like I was different. But like looking back, I don't know, it would have been interesting. These are some important things that sort of have popped up in the past couple of years that made me really curious about this issue. So One Child Nation is a documentary that came out, I think, in 2019 on Amazon Prime. It's super interesting. But this sort of revealed what was going on with the one child policy. And this was like all the information I never knew. And now I go back and I read a lot of books about it, and there's a lot of research about it. But it was really kind of life-changing because there were a lot of things I didn't know, such as like the child trafficking that was going on, the forced abortions. It's a pretty heavy documentary, but really interesting. And from this, there was a bunch of nonprofits, well, within this, nonprofits that sort of have arisen to help adoptees birth search or connect with their sort of fellow adoptee community. The second thing is sort of the Stop Asian Hate movement, as well as just Asian hate crimes, particularly targeted at young females, which I didn't personally encounter on a basis that I can remember. At the time, at the worst of COVID, I was in Hawaii, which was probably the most diverse place I've ever lived. Now I'm in Oregon, which is probably the least diverse place I've ever lived. But I personally haven't experienced hate from the context of the pandemic, and knowing that there was a lot of racism because of the pandemic. But nonetheless, like, seeing those headlines is pretty horrifying, especially when it's like the age and demographic of myself. And just thinking about women around the country who are sort of like dealing with this. So it's really horrible, but it was eye-opening for me, I think. And then I sort of was reflecting upon, though I don't think I've experienced discrimination from the pandemic, I would say, like, it brings me back to a lot of memories in like middle school and high school, in which like the model minority myth was really prevalent, in which, like, you know, Asians are sort of held to a higher standard of minorities, and so their stereotypes tend to be like good stereotypes, so like hardworking and successful. But like but now I'm kind of getting more informed, and then that actually kind of is like a wedge to other minorities, and it creates a lot of like more hostility and division than so anyways, but like when you're young and like people want to cheat off you, or they think you're smart just because you're Asian, like it's not super fun. And these are some sort of like interesting questions that I've connected with adoption and environmentalism. And I also have a adoptee friend who is like creating this project specifically about elevating adoptee experiences within the context of environmentalism. So it's kind of interesting, but like you can make a lot, or I like to make my own parallels of sort of like experiences from my past and how they connect to my present. And so the question of silences, so like what kind of silences have you experienced in your own life? I forget how do you negotiate these silences in relation to uncertain climate futures? Now that I know more about the one-child policy, I kind of actually see myself as like a survivor, because not everybody lived through that. There was like sometimes babies were abandoned. Well, I was told to be abandoned in the streets, but sometimes babies were actually abandoned in the streets and not found. And because it was illegal to have more than one child, it also created a lot of abortions. So that could have very much been a reality. And then like you flash forward to 2022, and there's all these abortion laws that are, and the possibility of Roe v. Wade being overturned. So like it's coming, all this stuff is like very much, I think, making the connections for me. But like if you think about trauma and sort of adversity, can trauma sort of prepare you for other adversities or other trauma? Maybe, I don't know. And then this idea of home, and I think for adoptees it's very different. And I never even thought about the combination of the words adoptee and environmentalism until recently. But I do think, like, particularly, I would say that my connection to youth in particular, like I've worked with youth since I was 16. I think it does probably stem from being an adoptee, whether I realize it or not. And then also there was this idea, which I've never heard of this either, but the idea of coming out of the fog. But one thing I think that is important, especially for international adoptees, is like the lucky idea, which is not inherently, like, I don't think it's intentional at all, but oftentimes if I talk about adoption, which I really don't often, but people will be like, oh, you're so lucky to be adopted, like, which also has, I think, unintentional white privilege infused with it. Like, not saying that it's supposed to be intentionally privileged, but it kind of has this tone of like, you're so lucky to be in this country. Like, thank God you got out of like communist China, right? So that, I think, unintentionally, first of all, puts sort of China in a negative light, as well as like makes an adoptee think that like their life is so great because of this traumatic event, which was essentially outside of their control. So it's just something to think about. I personally know that this idea of luckiness or lucky is well intentioned, but I do like to tell people of like the other side of it and how it can be interpreted. My parents always say like, we're the lucky ones to have adopted you. And I think that's a good way to frame it. And then so now I want to sort of shift a little bit to climate change and what is happening in the world. I learned about climate change probably first when in 4th or 5th grade, but I studied it in college, and honestly, it keeps getting worse than my knowledge about it, the realities about climate change. But it's interesting to think about this idea of having less children as a solution to climate change. And so there's this just graph showing like, all right, you can recycle, you can also eat a plant-based diet, but also like a huge, much bigger impact is to have one fewer child. But does that mean that we should go around and tell people they can only have one child? Like, probably not. Whoops. But yet women all across the world, I think, are having this moral dilemma, myself included, of like, should I have children? Personally, at the moment, I feel like I do not want to have children. Knowing what I know, I would like to give the world 5 years and see how we act on climate change, but I am pretty cynical about it. But honestly, within this idea of climate change solutions, one of the biggest solutions is actually just educating women and giving women reproductive rights and healthcare. And within that, women can make decisions in which they naturally will have less children. So that is probably a better solution than telling people that they can only have one child. But nonetheless, the ethical question is still there for women. And to me, the fact that women even have to question their own right to have children because of climate change is wrong. It means that our society is flawed. And so, yeah, the policy in which I was adopted definitely infringed on women's rights and human rights. And I don't think I could ever see something like this being adopted in the US. But nonetheless, it's interesting to think about in terms of like, can you also restrict people's ability to pollute, right? Like, can you start taxing carbon? I think people would freak out. And I think COVID is a good example of that, and trying to get people to wear masks. And yeah, I think that these topics are important, and I don't think they're directly related. I think I just find meaning out of my experiences and how they connect to the world at large. But this is really important from an environmental justice perspective. And I didn't put this on here, but a climate justice perspective, which is slightly different. But environmental justice usually has to do with the fact that minorities and marginalized communities are often bear the worst impacts of environmental things, such as living by a landfill or living in an area that is more heavily polluted, being exposed to environmental health threats more so than other people because of redlining, because of various systemic issues that have been created over time. Climate justice, on the other hand, deals with justice as related to climate change. And so climate change is disproportionately affecting marginalized communities as well. So within climate change, like we see climate refugees, people who are literally displaced from their homes and have to move because of climate related disasters, people who live in countries that maybe don't have the infrastructure to handle things like droughts and heat waves and storms. I know in Arizona, my parents are building a second home to be able to literally leave Phoenix in the summer, but like not everybody can do that, right? And as the water decreases in the Southwest, I am severely concerned that only wealthy people will be able to have access to water, but we'll see how that goes. So environmental justice, climate justice. Another way I frame climate justice is this idea of young people are the most vulnerable, I would say, to climate change because they are living the longest and their brains are developing and they are inheriting climate change. They are going to bear the impacts of climate change the most out of any population. But within that, lots of other people, honestly, everyone will be affected, but other vulnerable populations include older people, younger people, outdoor workers, people with pre-existing health conditions, because climate change is also related to lots of health issues. There has been research showing that like climate change can, well, there's this interesting research showing that like heat is directly correlated to violence and aggression. And also there's been research connecting heat and related to climate change and suicide. So really interesting things from mental health perspectives and also physical health in terms of disasters and things like that. So, oh, that's where I was going. So when I work with students, when I work with young people, it doesn't matter what I'm teaching about, but I really think as an environmental educator, as a climate educator, like mental health needs to be talked about, because essentially what we're doing is we're teaching kids really, really tough realities at very young ages for developing brains and people who are coming into this world and forming opinions about the world, right? And I think that this is not gentle or light in any sense, because climate change is heavy, it's dark, it's depressing. I think studying it in college, I never really realized how much negative storytelling I was being fed and how much that was sort of contributing to my mental health. But I would say like even today, climate activists are emerging at even younger ages. So like Greta Thunberg, pretty sure she started climate striking when she was like 11. An 11-year-old compared to a 20-year-old, like that is vastly, yeah. So I like to ask students, what are your feelings about climate change? Number one, because they've probably never been asked that question. Number two, because naming emotions is really hard for students. I don't know, I came from a generation of like, mental health is a stigma. Also, like we suppress our emotions. That's probably not everybody, but the reality is that like social emotional learning is not necessarily explicitly taught to children. And so infusing this SEL work within climate change education, I think, is really where climate education needs to go. And though a lot of the focus is on youth mental health, I would say adults who work on climate change or work in sustainability also experience these things. But because they're adults, there's this kind of like bigger pressure of like saying something like, I have eco anxiety, right? Like adults might not want to share that. But yeah, and thinking about really how climate change is being communicated, because for me, it was perhaps in a college classroom, but for a lot of youth, it's like social media. And so that might not always be the best route in which to digest these really difficult topics and realities. When I moved here, like the entire air was fogged because of fires, and it was very apocalyptic. And honestly, for a lot of these youth, like they might have experienced direct climate trauma in the form of natural disasters. So like if anyone ever like lost their home to a wildfire or to a flood or experienced anything like that is definitely traumatic. So here's a list of climate emotions that this field of like eco psychology, social workers, psychologists, as well as just climate scientists are sort of realizing that climate emotions are being born, and you cannot be clinically diagnosed with eco anxiety, but that doesn't mean it's not real. So I would say like, and honestly, that might be the next step, is to like literally clinically diagnose these things. But a lot of these emotions just need to be named in the first place, because I think lived experiences in this case are far outweigh the direct research supporting this field right now. But that doesn't mean lived experiences are wrong in any sense. So eco anxiety is probably the most popular in the news right now. But it's basically a fear or a worry about environmental degradation that that is either happening now or will happen in the future. And it's associated with both the individual's future, but also future generations. Solastalgia is kind of an interesting one, but it is sort of what results after destructive changes to a home or territory. So this could be like a wildfire or a flood or a drought, affecting someone who calls a place home, but home is drastically changed due to climate change. And climate loss and grief is often associated. It can be loss of really anything, but primarily it will be like conservationists, for example, who deal with extinction on a daily basis. They know and are very aware of the loss of species, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of ecosystems. We are creating the sixth mass extinction. Before it was like meteors and like huge events, but it's actually us right now. So eco-mindfulness is the term that I like to use as a solution, because we can practice mindfulness and we can develop regulating skills and emotional capacity to hold these emotions and acknowledge them. And it's often just a lot of questioning. So a lot of like questioning the way that things are, the way that things the way that we want things to be, power relations, consumer behaviors. You can do a mindfulness activity for like anything related to climate change. So you can walk through where your clothes come from, where your food comes from, where your energy comes from, and it can get pretty serious. I don't know like if mindful is the best word, because it's not exactly like peaceful, but that's not really what mindfulness is either. But it's an awareness of like how things are connected to the environment, how we are connected to the environment, and how we are part of nature and not separate from it. Species shame, which honestly I think I undergo a lot, but actual shame from being part of the one species that is actively destroying the one home we have. Climate envy is an interesting one, but perhaps people desire things that others have in relation to the climate crisis. So maybe they have better resources or more adaptation, or there's more acceptance around climate change, or there's more action. Like I think I feel envy towards other countries who are actively doing more than perhaps the US is. And then there's only one really positive emotion in here, but that's okay. Climate compassion, practiced by caring for others, places affected by climate change. Climate shame and guilt. I think this one is interesting too. But I think a lot of students experience like the I'm not doing enough to really like, how is me recycling going to change climate change, which is a totally valid question. And corporations and oil companies have also, just by marketing, shifted the sense of responsibility on the individual as opposed to the producer, which is also unethical, but it is happening. So look at water bottle companies, look at like any non-renewable source of energy. It's definitely happening. And individual action, I think all of climate action starts with individual action, but the reality is that corporations and the fossil fuel industry has caused climate change. But we as individuals also are going to have to be willing to make lifestyle changes to be able to adapt to big structural changes that need to happen. And then the idea of an eco pooper, which I got from the All We Can Save book, which is a really wonderful book about women climate activists. But the idea that there's always someone in the room who probably brings up a depressing environmental fact, which I really like actively try to not like tell people that I work on climate change, especially on a first date, because like I care that you care about climate change, but it's not the most like exciting, hopeful conversation. And then beyond that, it's like this idea of what language is missing, what experiences are people having that is not being talked about and not being named. But I think naming these emotions is huge, and letting students know that they're not alone in these feelings, and also letting students know that adults feel this as well, because then that sort of breaks down the natural power dynamics, I think. So I put all these emotions into various thought bubbles. One, because I think students sometimes have all these thoughts, but they can't like label them, right? Because like, how much do they spend worrying? How much do they spend judging themselves? How much do they spend worrying about the future? How much do they spend thinking about social media, right? But you can take all these emotions and you can reframe them. And I think that's what I really like to emphasize with students, is that all of these emotions are here for a reason, and they often are a reflection of something deeper. So should I have kids? When I experience this, I basically tell myself that those two things have nothing to do with each other, and that my choice to have kids should not be filled with guilt or shame. When I think that I'm not doing enough or I'm not making enough impact, I think, well, that's okay, because I will do what I can. Climate anger, I think, is big around students. Basically, like, it can be anger at politicians, it can be anger at systems, but it also can just be like anger at your parents, which is interesting. But this idea that older generations created climate change and left it for younger generations to fix and to solve, which can be really infuriating. So, but if you think of rage as a reflection of a desire for justice, I would say like this generation is the most concerned about the environment, about social justice, at very young ages. I'm amazed at like what these students know about political and social issues. Grief. So grief of loss is a reflection of love, right? So, and I think for a lot of us is like, we really care about the world and we really care about people. And so this idea of loss, loss for our children and loss for future generations can be really powerful. And when it comes to this sense of like individual responsibility versus collective responsibility, we have to really realize that the climate crisis is a shared responsibility. Within world politics, I think you can get messy because people are like, the US needs to do more, China needs to do more, India needs to do more, but like pointing fingers is not going to help the problem. And the reality is like, all we do with the world is like once a year, we sit down and we talk about like climate goals. And none of that is enforceable. COP is unfortunately light conversations in which we like share what we're doing about climate and try to make these drastic goals, but they are not really enforced. And so we have to realize that we are collectively working on climate change, but there are sort of questions of, well, if you historically created climate change, you should probably spend more money and resources to fix it, which I fall on that sort of side. But nonetheless, looking for climate hope stories, I think, is a really powerful solution, especially around the world, because a lot of people are doing this work. A lot of it is creative and things that can be exciting technologically, but also a lot of them have to do with social solutions, which I think we probably need to rely on more than technology, but that's a personal opinion. And what I do with students is climate journaling, just because journaling is such a powerful way to learn. I love journaling, but also, you know, not everybody wants to share their emotions about climate change. And I really think first we need to name emotions and acknowledge that this is essentially a mental health crisis. And as climate change is exacerbated around the world, like more of this is going to come out. If you all browse the New York Times, there was an article the other day about a climate activist that set himself on fire in front of the Supreme Court. So this is like, I think, a very good example of what we might see in the future, and sort of as more youth come to this awareness of how climate change affects their mental health, like what does that mean for us? So these are some prompts I've thrown on there, which I'll remember to share these slides. But for me, a lot of it is grounding and thinking about environmental identity and sorts of like, what is most important, what is most valuable, what is most worth living on this planet for. And a lot of that times, for me, it's just spending time outside, spending time with loved ones. So first, we sort of have to see ourselves as we as humans are just another species on the planet, right? And we are connected to everything on the earth that we use, from the land, the water, the microorganisms in the soil, to all the resources that we use. All of them come from the earth. So we are not separate from nature. We are part of it. And I, as an optimist, like to think that the climate crisis is an actual opportunity to rebuild and reestablish our relationship with the planet, and also to like just fundamentally change the way we've been doing things. Same way that like COVID sort of shook up the workplace, and now a lot more employers have to give flexibility to their employees around working remote. I think the climate crisis is a harsh wake up to the way that we need to change what we think of as success, to change the way we think about money, all sorts of things. And beyond like journaling, there are a lot of other ways to process climate change. There is climate art, climate music. I've seen stand-up comedy around climate change, like climate change memes. There's so many things that are funny. And this idea of finding cultural meaning in climate-related distress, staying inspired, thinking about vulnerable populations, and extending care beyond ourselves. And just honestly taking moments to appreciate things about the earth, about being outside, little things. I think like in the PNW, I really appreciate like when the sun comes through the trees. It's always more special because it doesn't happen a lot. And another activity is to like write a letter, and you can send warm wishes to another species, a younger sibling, or a future generation. Just sort of envisioning what your sustainable future looks like, and doing that thing where like when I'm thinking about friends who are going through a hard time and sending them well wishes, like you could do that to other beings and in the future at really any point in time. And so I just put this on as a personal thing, but I write about all of these things actively. This is my more personal, professional blog where I talk a lot about these issues if you're interested. And I'm trying to see what time it is, but now I'll just open it up to questions and thoughts. And actually, I think after answering the questions, if people want to share sort of like what their thoughts and impressions of this topic is, I'd be really interested to know. I also recently did my first training with mental health professionals about climate and eco emotions, and wondering like, do people actually hear about these eco anxiety, or do your students or your children share these thoughts? So I'd be really curious to hear, but we can do questions first, whatever works.
Couldn't unmute. Hi, it's Shemin again. How are you? So I thought it was, I will tell you, is a little mind-boggling in a good way, in thinking of how this crisscrosses in so many ways. There was so many things that you talked about the environment that actually had some phrases that had to do with, you know, how we're learning about people are feeling in the adoption and foster care field, or life journeys. And it's interesting with how anxiety with climate change, I thought it was very interesting how you said that this generation is more aware, more able to advocate for climate change, activism, just so many different things. I know I'm not being very clear. I'm kind of all over the place because I was trying to kind of relate both of them together, and I'm like, wow, it kind of does relate together, and how wonderful that this generation is able to get up and say something. Kind of like the last speaker showed us a video of children in, I think it was 109, the school that made a video about their journey and doing hip hop. So I think it's kind of awesome. that we have such young people being able to be a voice, because my generation were never really allowed to have, or were stifled to have a voice in any way, no matter where you were coming from. So I appreciate the information and how of what you've stated is basically what I'm going for. And I'm going to read a little bit more as I go along.
Thank you.
Megan, this is Renee Heddick. So I parent 4 children, three children born in China. And now they're 21, 19, and 15. And I think it's just a really fascinating intersection between the one-child policy and climate change. So that was an interesting thought. But then what I'm really curious about is, 2 of my children are now young adults. And as they reflect on climate change and their history and their connection to it and their family plan, do I or don't I bring a child into the home, into the world? And one child is like, no, that would impact the climate. And the other child is, I need a child who looks like me. So I'm just curious, what are you hearing in the adoption community as they reflect on the fact that, the one-child policy was a climate change policy, part of it was, and now these young Chinese Americans are struggling with their decisions around family planning.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I've seen a couple of perspectives from adoptees. One of them being like, there was this article about like China's changing it to 3 children now. Like, how do y'all feel about this? And everybody was like, what? Like, when did this exist? So there can be like, I think this comparison, right? Like this anger at like, we didn't get these choices. Same with climate change. Like this wasn't a choice before, this wasn't something I had to question before, and now it is. I think with climate change, it's also like, for me, I think a lot from what I hear of parents is that like having a child and can be one of the most like satisfying, meaningful things. And so like, if that's what a meaningful life means to you, you shouldn't have to give that up because of climate change. But it might mean that like raising a kid is a little bit harder because you have to think constantly about their future. I think also with, I lost my train of thought, but I think that with adoptees having the desire to have children that look like you, I think that can perhaps be not fulfilled because it can't be replaced. But for me, I find a lot of hope in this reality that DNA in 10 years could perhaps reunite all of us, like that, or so I've heard. Because like I've been presented with like, well, you could hire a searcher and you could go back to China and you could put your photo on Chinese TikTok, which all of those things make me super uncomfortable. Or like, oh, you could try to get someone to cover your story, but like that's been done before, right? Like, so is your story that much more important than other people's? But my hope is that DNA will connect us with our birth families in one way or the other, and that we'll feel that connection in that way. But have I always wondered like what I would look like as a baby? Yeah, sure. And I think honestly, a lot of it though is going to come with adoptees being connected to other adoptees, because to me that is the strongest bond of getting to know people who have experienced your trauma as well, and when it's people who look like you and who are also like, misplaced or whatever. So but yeah, thank you for sharing. Cheryl, do you have a question?
Yeah, I actually have a question in framed around, first of all, I find it very interesting how you've paired climate change with adoption. And my son is almost going on 16 in a few months and adopted from Central America. And I find whenever climate change comes up, he knows a lot about it, and yet he doesn't, his expression around it is, I don't care, we're all gonna die anyway. And it's extremely frustrating for me as an environmentalist to hear the desperation and the lack of will to live, even, because we're all going to die anyway. And even with this, the war in the Ukraine right now, he really believes that the button's going to be pushed and we're all going to die. So it's hard to face that as a single parent too, not only a parent, but a single parent. And I'm hoping that there's something I could do. I mean, he refuses to partake in things. He refuses to do anything because there's really no hope in his life. So I don't know if you can speak to that. It's pretty huge. But I appreciate the pairing of what your research has shared.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. No, that's really important. I think there's two potential, I don't know, starts of solutions, but one of them being, I think, the biggest thing for students to feel connected to climate change is spending time in nature, because it has so many mental and physical benefits for us that we don't necessarily get in school or on a daily basis. And that's kind of how wilderness therapy arose from the field of ecopsychology, is like this realization that we should be healing outside. And at least for me, like I think doing things like hiking and doing things like rock climbing, all things that are very, very present, a lot of that is what pairs my ability to do climate activist work. Because if I wasn't able to really separate and sort of re-engage or engage in the world in a different way without sort of worrying about these issues all the time, but also just like developing a greater sense of place, I think is really important. Because when you have places that you care about, then you sort of might shift that to thinking about the world at large and places that you essentially want to save. And I think climate action is going to have to happen from all angles. And when students feel paralyzed, or the term, my therapist termed this, they feel like a climate hostage, like they are hostage to climate change and they can't do anything about it. That's when really, I think, severe mental health things can arise, such as disassociation or this sense of like giving up because things are so bad, right? But I think eventually it has to come to a reframe of the situation, and also a reality that there's a lot of good out there as well, that it's not always easy to see. And when you start sort of acting on climate change, then you realize that it's not such a passive thing. So if there are ways to engage, your child in climate action in small ways that are enjoyable, like not everybody wants to write angry letters to their politicians. I totally get that, but there are so many meaningful things to do. I mean, gardening is, I think, a activity that a lot of people, at least in Eugene, really connect to. But there are many different things that can make you a little bit more aware and just like equipped to handle these harsh realities, because it's really not easy. I've sort of embraced that like climate change will be something I work on for the rest of my life. But to be able to do that, you have to like have very, very significant and substantial self-care, because otherwise you burn out. So yeah.
I have a question about the journaling piece. You stated, please correct me if I got this wrong. Did you say you quote unquote teach to do K through 12? Did you say that right?
Yes.
So give me some ideas for the younger kids. Do you have the younger kids try to journal, or what kind of ideas? So say for instance, they can't write or they're not able to do that. What kind of journaling would you recommend, or examples of how you've asked people to do that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I haven't actually taught this lesson specifically to younger students yet, but one of the topics I get a lot is food waste. And with younger students, that's usually bringing worms in. So with any activity, I like to start with a mindfulness activity. So whether it's like holding worms, touching worms, thinking about how worms like make better soil and food for us, that can be a way to connect younger students. Or to be like, if we talk about like 40% of the food in America goes to waste, like how does that make you feel? Students are easily able to like name their emotions about that. And I think for a lot of the younger ages, yeah, it's just like getting them outside, getting them dirty in nature and playing and realizing that they are allowed to interact with nature in this way. Like we should not be telling them they can't touch things and break things and throw things type of thing. But with younger students, it's definitely like even saying the word climate change to me or to younger students is hard for me because like I don't want to sugarcoat climate change either. But honestly, like you can be surprised by like 4-year-olds' knowledge of climate change at the same time. So so it's not like, yeah, it's an unfortunate reality though that that you have to sort of bring a really tough topic to them. But they also have so much more energy and like hope and optimism, I think, than older students. So a lot of that time it can just be like fun ways engaging with nature. Nature journaling, I think is, or I don't know if, but drawing outside, you can do, with younger students, you could do a sound map where you, for younger students, I guess you'd have to blindfold them, but you sit in a spot and you make marks on a map of like where you hear things. So if it's a bird or like another hiker or a bee, and you kind of like orient those sounds around yourself, which can be grounding.
Awesome, thank you.
Ooh, and then I just saw your question. Does anyone have suggestions regarding environmental camps or teen camps that are focused on cooperative work or play in nature? I find it hard to find families to do this with, so. Oh. Yeah, camp is such a powerful mechanism, I think, for youth to connect with the world. For me, it honestly really shaped my identity and my environmental identity. So I'm very grateful for camp. And there's so many camps out there like that have so many different focus areas, but like I know STEM is really big or has been really big too, but
I think the change came years and years ago with the fact that our generation, the older generation, since we didn't have these iPads and phones and all that stuff, we were more in touch with nature because we really didn't have any quote unquote choices. So, you know, you just saying, just picking up a worm just brings me back to the fact that I did go in the, I was constantly in the dirt. We were making, I mean, obviously the jokes of mud pies and things like that. So it's kind of like trying to just moving forward from the electronic age. It's good to know some of it and how to use it to keep up with everybody, but at the same time, we need to get them out there, get them outdoors.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of my favorite books in the world is Richard Louv, and he wrote Last Child in the Woods. And I actually think maybe I was in the generation of like one of the last generations that experienced an outdoor childhood in which I was trusted to go outside and come back before dinner, right? But also like I grew up in New Jersey in a very small neighborhood. I would say like my Arizona friends did not have the same childhood, but that's also like because of the desert. But nonetheless, like it's interesting to think about also the ways in which we've substituted entertainment, because like before we had to figure out how to entertain ourselves in nature, and now we have everything at our disposal and in there, and can often be overstimulating. So yeah. But also and then his second book talks about this idea of a nature deficit disorder, because we no longer have outdoor childhoods. We actually, and because we're infused more with technology, we have a nature deficit, and that's why we need to find new ways to re-engage with nature, such as these networks in which families can go outside and spend time in nature, or that nature can be infused within everything we do, from like gardens to schools to hospitals, to our cities, so that we have access to nature, and that it's not restricted to like these national parks that not everybody can afford to go to or have access from transportation. And nature has to come closer. Nature has to be closer to us so that we can see it in our backyards, so that it's not as like pristine.
This is Renee Heddick again. I'm just curious because my kids always talk about nature bathing, right? Getting out into nature. Do you know what the research is around that?
So I always like to say like barefoot grounding to people as a solution. And when I say the research I've looked up, like it kind of seems a little, I don't know enough about the research, but I know that there is research that being in nature lowers our stress levels and our heart rate. The difference between physically breathing outside versus breathing inside is like really great for our brains. The grounding thing though is like I've read on the internet that supposedly like when you're bare feet and you're like in soil, that the electrons are, I don't know, giving you energy from the earth. I don't know if that's actually true. I like to think it is, but also I just like to think more from the observational aspect of like when I'm in nature, I'm calmer. There's research that shows that being in nature makes us nicer and more cooperative as well. And we're able to connect with people more in nature. So I like to think more of like lived experiences rather than research, because sometimes it doesn't always make sense to me. I've also heard that like our brains like the color green more. So that could also sort of connect to the idea of forest bathing, which I know is like super popular in Japan. And like all of like the Portland Japanese gardens is like all themed based off of forest bathing. And also like thinking about, I think, getting into contact more directly with the elements. So like how cold water can be like healing, right? So like if we jump into like a cold spring and we come out and we feel like refreshed, even like rain, I think, can do that. Like if you go out on a hike and you're like soaked, but you're cold, but you feel more alive type of thing. Like playing in mud can just be, I don't know, satisfying in its own way. So I'm not quite sure the reasons why, but I just know that there has been lots of connections to lowering our stress levels and making us feel a little bit better.
Hey, my college son just came home. Excuse me just a second.
No, I think it's kind of interesting because sometimes, you know, when we were talking over the last couple of days about regulation and trying to be calm, I think one of the things, and we were talking about it at the sleep workshop last night, you know, some people like listening, which our family loves, is the nature sounds before bed. It is quite interesting how we can, even just from our own little house, that's all right. So we're not really around nature all the time. So how can we bring nature to us or enjoy just, I mean, he likes listening to ocean sounds to make him fall asleep and calming. So you have some points about how just the fresh air, the rain. I will tell you, as a kid, I remember jumping in puddles and just, I mean, it was freezing, but I absolutely loved it. And just being outside is an amazing, you know, go get some fresh air, but we're screaming at it, but at the same time, we really do mean go get some fresh air. It does help in lots and lots of ways. So
yeah, and the contrary, right, is like noise pollution, because when we live in, there's definitely research of when we live in cities that have air pollution and noise pollution, we're a lot more like chaotic and scattered than we would be if we lived in a more peaceful neighborhood. So there's this whole field called soundscape ecology, where you can actually measure the health of an ecosystem just by listening, because you can like hear what nature sounds like when it's undeveloped versus when it is developed and impacted by human development. It's kind of interesting, but sounds tell a lot. So does anyone have any more questions or reflections, or want to talk about their climate emotions? I'd be curious.
When you say when you say that, give me a little bit more. You know, I like to talk. What do you mean by
like,
tell me what?
So perhaps like, and for, I assume the most of this panel is like perhaps parents. So like as parents, do you experience worries about climate change for your kids? Do you experience your own anxiety about climate change and how it will affect you and your family? Or
Yeah, no,
how much
I will
do you know
say
about climate change too?
I'm in my early 50s, and just knowing that in the future, like on your last one here about the future generation, do I worry about what kind of things will be there for them? What kind of things? Listen, I even think about the animals that may or may not be here as part of their future. Do I do anything about it? There's some things I do make some changes. Do I do composting? Not really. We've tried it. It didn't work so good. But yeah, I do think about what they're going to have versus what I did, because there's going to be a lot of losses to it. So there is some anxiety to it. And I'm hoping as they go through life, we're having these conversations, we're talking about nature, and still getting them outside. I want them to understand what we had when we were able to play when we were younger and just go camping. We take them camping every year with other adopted children and teens and foster kids every year, because that's a way that they can engage with each other in a natural environment at least once a year. I mean, if I can do it. So yeah, there's a little bit of worry. I'll be honest.
Yeah,
And I have tons of worry. I'm like the biggest Debbie Downer there is. I really am. I'm scared to death. I used to want grandchildren. Now I don't. And I'm really thankful that my kids are at least walking, talking adults, and I don't have to worry about, like, they can run. But we are farming. Like, that's all we do at our house is talk about farming and getting more land so we can farm, because we're really concerned about food shortages. And that's the reality that I live every day.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I know that one of the things that has arisen from this work is the idea of climate cafes. I know they're a lot bigger in Europe, but hopefully they'll slowly make their way to the US, where people can just talk about their associated worries with climate change. There are even more specific groups like mothers who worry about climate change type of thing. So I think a lot of the solutions really lie within a community and within just like creating spaces for people to talk about it and share and listen, because it can just be really powerful that way with connecting with other people. I know one of my goals has been to like do this with friends, because a lot of my friends don't work in climate work. And so it's really hard to relate to them on these sorts of emotions, but finding like friend colleagues, especially I think as a young professional, is like, if you can sit down with your boss and talk about eco anxiety, like that is such a powerful way to relate to each other and to support each other in this space, because it definitely is, it's a new space. And I think a lot of the ways in which we can process is just by talking about it. And there's certainly many more solutions that need to come, but yeah, conversation can be super meaningful. And I think therapists are now sort of slowly being trained on climate change and all of these concepts. And so it's also coming into social work, but to really make it accessible to all people, it's got to happen in more informal ways, because not everybody has access to therapy, let alone climate conscious therapy. But I'll actually drop the name of, here, let me drop the website too. But he's like a world-renowned psychologist in this work, and he is based out of Portland. So actually he's my therapist, but he has a, here, I'll stop sharing. He has a website, I think it's called like Sustainable Self, but there's a lot more. He trains psychologists, and he also sort of does the work surrounding environmental identity, because I think the worst trouble we can get into is like if we are experiencing all these things and we're not doing anything about it, and we're staying inside, and we're sort of like sulking, right, in this like depression about the climate. So with nature being a huge source of therapy, but and like for me, it's realizing that like when you go into a therapy session, like even though my therapist is all about the climate, so sometimes I feel like all I'm doing is talking about work so that I can be a better worker. But the reality that like you also have personal things going on in your life in addition to your climate anxiety, and like all of those things are important, so they should all be valued.
Megan, thank you so much for everything that you're sharing. I relate to you so much on this topic. One, as an international adoptee myself, and two, as somebody who has so much love and so much passion for the outdoors. I mean, I try to camp every weekend during the summer. I really, I have so much love for it. And I think the intersection of adoption and nature is so fascinating, because I've thought about it in certain aspects, but I really appreciate the angle that you came at today. And it's really been giving me a lot to think about, especially when it comes to kind of family planning, because I imagine for probably a lot of adoptees, and I think a lot of people, I think a lot of us have so many different emotions surrounding family planning, and so many external like influences and ideas, from either like parents or, even your own idea of, like, I don't know if gratitude necessarily comes into it, but I know for me, I felt this pressure to, of giving birth to a child, because I was like, this is something that I didn't have. I don't have that, connection, that biological connection. So wouldn't I want that? And so, but coming to a space where I'm like, I don't know if that's necessarily what I want. And I think that's really fascinating. And I also, on the educational front, I wanted to mention that one of my kind of favorite books at this point is Don Rakow's book, Nature RX, improving college student mental health. And he's a professor at Cornell. And so through that and through my own interests, I've found myself also kind of integrating into the connection between nature and mental health. And so I just appreciate so much of, what you brought today. And it's really been giving me a lot to think about. And even at the coalition, we have teen programming and kind of the idea of how to bring that in, even though we are very much in a virtual space. So I don't know if you have any suggestions in that area, how it can engage, kids kind of tend to, it's pretty much like 10 to 17-year-olds where, we break the group up, but how to bring kind of an environmental aspect and climate change aspect to a virtual space where we aren't necessarily able to be together outside. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's always a good one. Because that has been largely the way I've been teaching, which is not my preferred way of teaching. But I think a lot of the nature things can be sort of like the fun homework, essentially, right? Like, or so like us having at least like giving ideas of like, these are ways in which you can interact with nature, and they're optional, but like, let's try them and talk about it and see how it went. In terms of like the virtual environmental ed type of things. This is always tricky because for me it's been traditionally slideshows and videos, which is not always fun. But I think also in one way, Zoom is interesting in which it does kind of allow an interesting way in conversations, whether it's breakout rooms or polls. Like you can kind of get a good sense of what students are thinking and feeling. And so in that way, I think having like a climate conversation could be very doable. Listening to like books and podcasts about environmental things, watching sustainability documentaries. There's so many ones out there that are honestly like mind-boggling. And sometimes honestly, like Seaspiracy, I think I had to like stop watching because it was so sad. But
I had to watch in parts.
yeah. But then there's like great ones like My Octopus Teacher that like, you know, you cry in a good way. So
Mhm.
doing stuff like that and then coming together and talking about those things. Because yeah, I think you have to just throw in a lot of like hopeful stories. And I think on it, the thing that keeps me the most hopeful is the youth activism around it. And I think students have so many of these emotions and they're just like ready to pour out. So whether it's through like comedy and I think honestly that's probably one of the biggest reactions with young people is like deflecting with humor, but it can also be very good, like and a good way to sort of cope with climate change. So I personally want to start some sort of like campaign around climate change and humor in an educational setting.
It's a great idea. Yeah, I'm even thinking of, because you were talking so much about how social media has played such a role, especially with kind of the younger generations. And I think of, you know, TikTok and, you know, what are Instagram reels and things like that. And I very much see, you know, exactly what you're talking about, that the kind of, you know, laugh in the face of, you know, tragedy, I guess, when it comes to climate change. And I think, right, you know, allowing you to feel all of those raw emotions, but also giving you a space to be like, this is just the most ridiculous thing ever. Like we feel so out of control, but we're all feeling out of control together. And there are things that we can do to have some control, you know, but also putting the pressure back on people, like, and, you know, on corporations that really are most responsible. So I think that's a great idea as well. And that's something maybe I will also incorporate, you know, TikTok videos, just because they're so short and so engaging. So thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
We appreciate the perspective is what I think is what I'm taking out of this. It's a great way of looking at it. Never even dawned on me, like I just said, I'm like, that's very interesting. All right, that's great. So we appreciate you taking the time to do this today very much.
Yeah, thank you for letting me share my story. And yeah, if anyone has any questions personally, just feel free to reach out.
Yeah.